Commander Vexthul stood at the observation deck of the massive dreadnought Eternal Dominion, his 6 eyes scanning the blue-green planet below. Earth, such an ordinary name for what the Galactic Council now considered the most dangerous world in known space. The irony wasn't lost on him. 3 cycles ago, humans had been nothing more than a footnote in galactic records. A primitive species that had barely mastered faster than light travel. Now, representatives from 12 of the most powerful military civilizations in the galaxy had gathered to witness what humans called training exercises. The word itself made Vexthul's mandibles click in. Amusement. Training. As if beings who had conquered death itself needed to practice warfare. Commander, came the voice of Submarshal Kalen, a Draknari warrior whose species had perfected combat for over 10,000 years. The humans have confirmed our observation window. They will begin their drills in 30 standard minutes. Vexthul turned from the viewport, his armored form reflecting the cold light of distant stars. Around him, the galaxy's finest military minds had assembled. General Zoreth of the Mantid Hegemony, whose insectoid warriors could tear through starship hulls with their bare claws. Admiral Sektan from the Void Corsairs, whose people had never lost a single space battle in recorded history. War Chief Brutus of the Orcish Confederacy, standing nearly 3 meters tall and wearing ceremonial bone armor that had been blessed in the blood of 100 conquered worlds. These weren't observers, they were the measuring stick by which all military might in the galaxy was judged. And yet, something about humanity had made them all nervous enough to gather here, watching and waiting like students before an exam. "Tell me again why we're here," rumbled Brutus, his tusks gleaming as he spoke. "These humans, they've existed for what? Barely a few thousand cycles of spaceflight. My people were conquering star systems when theirs were still hitting rocks together." Admiral Sektan's tentacles writhed in what his species considered a thoughtful gesture. "Because, War Chief, 3 standard months ago, a single human frigate disabled an entire Kareth invasion fleet without firing a shot. Because human mercenaries have been hired to resolve conflicts that our combined militaries couldn't handle. Because." He paused, his silver eyes reflecting an emotion that looked suspiciously like concern. "Because we don't understand how they fight." Vexthul had read the reports. Every military intelligence agency in the galaxy had been studying humanity since their rapid expansion into Council space. The humans possessed no superior technology, their weapons were efficient but unremarkable. Their ships were fast but not the fastest. Their soldiers were strong but not the strongest. On paper, humanity should have been absorbed into one of the major powers within a decade of first contact. Instead, human military contractors were now the most sought-after forces in the galaxy. Human tactical advisors commanded prices that would bankrupt small star systems, and human-trained armies had never lost a major engagement, regardless of the odds they faced. "The mystery isn't their technology," said General Zoreth, her compound eyes reflecting the holographic displays around them. "We've analyzed their equipment: standard kinetic weapons, basic energy shields, conventional propulsion. The mystery is how they use it." War Chief Brutus snorted. "Tactics can only take you so far. In the end, battle comes down to strength, speed, and killing power. My warriors have all 3 in abundance, and yet your warriors requested human tactical support for the siege of Gamaseti." Vexthul observed quietly. The Orcish leader's expression darkened, but he didn't deny it. The siege had been expected to last months and cost thousands of lives. With human advisors, it had ended in 3 days with minimal casualties. The humans had suggested something so simple, so obvious, that every military mind present had felt foolish for not thinking of it themselves. They had simply asked the planet's population to surrender in exchange for fair treatment. When the defenders had refused, the humans had proceeded to prove they could deliver on their promise by providing aid to civilian populations caught in the crossfire. Within hours, the planet's own people were demanding their government accept the terms. No orbital bombardment, no massive ground assault, no mountain of bodies. Just common sense, applied with surgical precision. Motion sensors are detecting movement on the planet's surface. announced the ship's AI in a neutral tone. Human forces are assembling at the designated coordinates. Every being on the observation deck turned toward the main display screen. The image zoomed in, showing a vast plain on Earth's largest continent. What they saw defied easy categorization. The human force was small, perhaps 300 individuals, wearing what appeared to be standard combat gear. Their vehicles were equally unremarkable. Wheeled transports that looked like they'd been designed by committee, no massive war machines, no flying fortresses, no exotic weapons that bent reality to their will. "That's it?" Brutus laughed, a sound like grinding stone. 300 barely armed primitives? This is what has the galaxy's military leadership concerned. Admiral Sekton's tentacles had stopped moving entirely, a sign of deep concentration among his people. Computer, scan for additional forces in the surrounding area. Scanning. No additional military forces detected within a 1,000-kilometer radius. Cloaked ships? No gravitometric anomalies detected. No energy signatures consistent with cloaking technology. Vex Thul felt a chill run down his spine. He had seen human forces in action before, always as reports. Always second-hand accounts from shell-shocked survivors or bewildered allies. But this was 300 humans against what looked like empty terrain. "Perhaps," suggested General Zoreth, "their exercise is defensive in nature? Testing equipment or formations against simulated attacks?" The words had barely left her mouth when the human formation began to move. And everything the observers thought they knew about warfare suddenly seemed inadequate. The humans didn't advance in formation. They didn't maintain rigid command structures or follow established tactical doctrines. Instead, they seemed to flow across the landscape like water, each small group moving independently while somehow remaining coordinated with the whole. "Computer, what are they doing?" Vex Thul asked. "Unknown. Human forces appear to be dispersing randomly across the exercise area." But it wasn't random. Vex Thul could see that much, even if he couldn't understand the pattern. Each group of humans was positioning itself with purpose. But purpose directed toward what end? War Chief Brutus was leaning forward now, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by puzzled concentration. Where is their enemy? Who are they fighting? As if in answer to his question, the ground beneath one group of humans suddenly erupted. What emerged defied classification. It was part machine, part biological nightmare, standing 12 feet tall and bristling with enough firepower to level a small city. The computers immediately identified it as a Class 7 war construct. The kind of automated weapon that typically required orbital bombardment to neutralize. The humans scattered like leaves in a windstorm. The construct's weapons tracked them. Energy beams and projectile fire, turning the landscape into a hellscape of destruction. Any conventional military force would have been annihilated in seconds. Instead, something impossible happened. The humans didn't retreat. They didn't call for support or heavy weapons. They simply adapted. Groups that had seemed randomly positioned suddenly revealed themselves to be perfectly placed for overlapping fields of fire. Soldiers who had appeared to be carrying standard equipment unveiled tools and weapons that seemed purpose-built for this exact situation. Within minutes, the war construct was disabled. Not destroyed, disabled. Its weapons offline. Its mobility systems damaged but repairable. Its central core intact and recoverable. "How?" Admiral Sekton whispered. Before anyone could attempt an answer, the ground erupted again. And again. And again. Dozens of war constructs, each one a different design, each one presenting a unique tactical challenge. Ancient Forerunner Guard units that hadn't been seen in 1,000 years. Experimental Kareth battle forms that existed only in classified military databases. Mantid assault drones that had never been deployed outside of the hegemony's most secure facilities. The humans faced them all. And not just faced them, they dismantled each threat with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. "This isn't possible," General Zoreth stated flatly. "These war constructs. Some of them are classified military assets. How did the humans acquire them for training purposes? Commander Vex Thul was beginning to understand, and the understanding terrified him. Computer analysis. Are these war constructs real or simulated? Energy signatures are consistent with genuine hardware. Weapon impacts show real destructive potential. Conclusion. War constructs are authentic military assets. The observation deck fell silent except for the whispered communications between species representatives and their home fleets. Each civilization present was suddenly recalculating everything they thought they knew about human capabilities. On the surface below, the 300 humans had scattered into groups so small they sometimes consisted of only 2 or 3 individuals. Yet somehow, these tiny units were coordinating attacks on threats that should have required entire battalions to handle. War Chief Brutus pointed at the display with one massive finger. There. Explain that to me. A pair of humans had encountered something that made everyone on the observation deck step back instinctively. It was a void stalker, a biomechanical nightmare from the deepest parts of space that could phase in and out of reality at will. Each one was worth at least a light cruiser in combat effectiveness, and they had never been successfully captured or studied because they typically self-destructed rather than allow examination. The 2 humans looked at it for perhaps 30 seconds. Then they began to move. What followed was not combat, as any of the observers understood it. It was more like a dance, or perhaps a conversation conducted in violence. The humans seemed to predict every move the stalker would make, positioning themselves not where it was, but where it would be. When it phased out of reality, they were waiting when it reappeared. When it unleashed weapons that could cut through starship armor, they had already moved to positions the creature couldn't target. In less than 5 minutes, the stalker was down. Alive, conscious, but completely immobilized by devices that looked like they had been cobbled together from spare parts. Impossible, Admiral Secton breathed. A void stalker has never been taken alive. The technology required to neutralize their phasing ability doesn't exist. Apparently, Vex Thul said quietly, it does now. The exercises continued for 3 hours. 3 hours of watching human forces encounter threats that individually would have challenged the combined might of the galaxy's greatest armies. Ancient war machines that had been lost in the void between stars. Experimental weapons that existed only in the fever dreams of military researchers. Autonomous defense systems from civilizations that had died out eons ago. The humans handled them all with the same casual efficiency they might have shown while performing routine maintenance on their equipment. As the final construct was disabled and the human forces began their withdrawal, the observation deck remained silent. Representatives of civilizations that had conquered galaxies, that had perfected the art of war across millennia, that had never known defeat in battle, stood in stunned silence. "Commander," came a voice from the communications array. "We're receiving a transmission from the surface. The humans are. They're requesting feedback on their performance." Vex Thul almost laughed. Feedback. As if what they had just witnessed was merely another training exercise to be evaluated and improved upon. "Tell them," he said slowly, "that their performance was adequate." The communications officer looked confused. "Sir? Just adequate?" "Yes," Vex Thul confirmed, still staring at the now quiet battlefield below. "Because if we tell them the truth that what we just witnessed was the most terrifying display of military capability in recorded galactic history, they might think they don't need to keep improving." War Chief Brutus was the first to break the extended silence. "My warriors," he said quietly, "have trained for battle since birth. Every day of their lives is dedicated to the perfection of warfare. And what I just saw?" He trailed off, shaking his massive head. "What you just saw," Admiral Secton finished, "was 300 humans treating an impossible tactical situation as routine practice." General Zoreth's compound eyes were fixed on the display, watching human teams methodically examine each disabled war construct. They're not even celebrating. To them, this was just another day's work. Commander Vex Thul turned away from the viewport and began walking toward the exit. He had seen enough. More than enough. "Sir?" called Submarshal Kalen. "Where are you going?" "To send a message to the Council," Vex Thul replied without turning back. "We need to discuss our alliance with humanity. Specifically, we need to discuss making sure that we never, ever give them a reason to view us as anything other than friends." As the observation deck emptied, each representative returning to their respective fleets to file reports that their superiors would likely dismiss as impossible. The planet Earth continued its lazy rotation below. On its surface, 300 humans were packing up their equipment and discussing what they had learned from the day's exercises. They had no idea that they had just redefined warfare for an entire galaxy. Sergeant Maria Santos checked her weapon one final time before looking up at the scorched sky above the training ground. Somewhere up there, she knew, the galaxy's most feared military commanders were watching through telescopes and sensors, trying to understand what they were about to see. She almost felt sorry for them. "All right, people," she called out to her squad, her voice carrying across the pre-dawn silence. "Remember, today's audience doesn't understand how we think. They're expecting us to fight like them, rigid formations, overwhelming firepower, traditional tactics. They have no idea what they're actually going to see." Private Kim Chen grinned as he adjusted his gear. "Should we tell them it's just Tuesday for us?" "Negative," Santos replied with a slight smile. "Let them figure it out themselves." The exercises had been designed by the human military's most creative minds, but not to show off. They had been designed to solve a problem that had been bothering human tacticians since first contact with galactic civilization. Every alien military they had encountered fought the same way, with overwhelming force applied through rigid command structures. It worked for them because they were stronger, faster, and had better technology than most species they fought. Humans had none of those advantages. What they had instead was something that the galaxy's greatest military minds consistently failed to understand: the ability to think differently about every single problem they encountered. "Enemy constructs are powering up," reported Corporal Jones from his position near the center of the formation. "Looks like they brought the full nightmare parade today." Santos nodded. The war constructs buried beneath the exercise ground represented threats that would challenge entire fleets. But that was the point. Humans didn't train for the fights they could win easily, they trained for the impossible ones. "Remember," she called out as her people began to spread out across the landscape, "every construct down there has one thing in common. Someone built it. Someone programmed it. Someone decided what its weaknesses would be. And anyone who can create a weakness can exploit it." The first eruption of earth and metal sent clods of dirt flying in all directions. What emerged was a Titangent-class assault mech, 30 feet of armored destruction, carrying enough firepower to level a city block. Its sensors immediately locked onto the nearest human targets and began firing. Santos had seen recordings of how other species dealt with Titan mechs. The Draknari would charge directly at it, trusting their superior speed and armor to survive long enough to reach close combat range. The Mantids would swarm it with hundreds of warriors, accepting massive casualties to bring it down through sheer numbers. The Orcs would simply fire bigger guns at it until one side or the other was completely destroyed. None of those approaches would work for humans. They weren't fast enough, numerous enough, or well-armed enough to make those tactics viable. But they had something else. "Chen, Rodriguez, take point," Santos called out as her squad scattered like water hitting hot stone. "Remember what we learned about the Mark 7 visual tracking system?" The two soldiers began moving in what looked like random patterns across the battlefield. To the alien observers above, it probably looked like panic. In reality, it was the result of months of studying captured Titangent-class mechs and learning a simple fact. Their targeting systems had been designed by logical minds to track logical movement patterns. Human movement, when they chose to make it so, was anything but logical. Chen suddenly stopped running and began walking slowly backward, while Rodriguez started moving in a perfect circle. The mech's weapons tracked them, but the targeting computer couldn't get a lock. It had been programmed to predict where targets would be based on where they had been. When targets began moving in ways that violated every tactical principle the mech's creators understood, the system became confused. While the massive war machine was trying to figure out why two humans were apparently having a dance-off in a combat zone, the rest of Santos's squad was implementing the second part of their plan. "Thermal lance is in position," reported Private Williams from somewhere behind the mech. "Initiating precision drilling." The thermal lance was a mining tool designed for cutting through asteroid rock, not military armor. But human engineers had discovered something interesting about Titangent-class mechs. Their armor was incredibly strong from the front and sides, but the joints where their legs connected to their torso were only protected by lighter material. That lighter material was strong enough to stop any conventional weapon, but it couldn't handle the sustained heat of a tool designed to cut through solid rock. The mech didn't even notice the thermal lance until its left leg suddenly stopped responding to commands. By then, Williams had moved to the right leg and begun the same process. Mobility compromised, Santos observed with satisfaction as the 30-foot war machine toppled forward with a ground-shaking crash. Chen, Rodriguez, stop confusing the poor thing and move to Phase 2. Phase 2 was even simpler than Phase 1. The mech was now lying on its front, weapons still functional but unable to target anything behind it. Santos's team simply walked around to its rear and began removing access panels with standard maintenance tools. Neural network link located, announced Specialist Park, her hands deep in the mech's control systems. Applying human logic virus. The logic virus was perhaps the most terrifying weapon in the human arsenal. Though it wasn't really a virus at all, it was simply a series of logical paradoxes and impossible scenarios fed directly into an artificial intelligence's decision-making system. AI systems created by other species were logical, predictable, and efficient. They were also vulnerable to having their thinking processes tied up in knots by problems that had no logical solution. Things like, calculate the exact value of pi, or determine the fastest way to reach a destination that doesn't exist, or optimize performance for a system with no defined parameters. Within minutes, the Titangent-class mech's AI had crashed itself, trying to process impossible requests. Its weapons powered down, its systems locked up, and what had been the galaxy's most feared autonomous war machine was now a very expensive piece of scrap metal. Target neutralized, Santos reported. Time elapsed. 11 minutes. 37 seconds. She could imagine the silence in the observation deck above. 11 minutes to completely disable a war machine that was supposed to be unstoppable. Using mining equipment and logic puzzles, the ground erupted again. This time, what emerged was something that made Santos whistle appreciatively. A void stalker. One of the most dangerous creatures in known space. It existed partially outside normal reality, could phase through solid matter at will, and possessed weapons that could cut through any known material. Interesting, she murmured into her comm unit. Alpha Team, we've got a reality shifter. Implementing Protocol 7. Protocol 7 was named after an old human story about a man who had caught death itself in a trap. The principle was simple. Anything that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously could be forced to choose which dimension it wanted to exist in, and once it made that choice, it was bound by the rules of that dimension. Santos's team began setting up what looked like a simple grid of metal posts across the battlefield. To the Void Stalker, they probably looked harmless, just humans playing with construction materials while it decided which of them to kill first. The posts weren't weapons. They were quantum anchor points, modified from equipment normally used to stabilize space-time distortions near experimental jump drives. When activated, they would force anything within their influence to exist in only one dimension at a time. The stalker attacked, phasing partially out of reality to avoid the humans' return fire. Its weapons carved through the landscape, missing the frantically dodging humans by inches. It was toying with them, the way a cat plays with a mouse before killing it. Then Santos activated the quantum anchors. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The Void Stalker suddenly became completely solid, completely real, and completely subject to the laws of physics that governed normal spacetime. Its weapons, designed to function across multiple dimensions, suddenly found themselves limited to operating in only 3. More importantly, the creature itself was no longer able to phase out of reality when things got dangerous. Light it up, Santos ordered calmly. Her team's weapons were nothing special, standard kinetic rifles firing conventional ammunition. But conventional ammunition worked just fine against targets that couldn't escape into parallel dimensions. The Void Stalker went down hard, stunned but alive. Within minutes, Santos's people had it secured with restraints that would keep the quantum anchors functioning even after the posts were removed. Another one for the research teams, she announced. They'll be thrilled to finally get a live specimen. The exercises continued throughout the morning. Each new threat that emerged from the ground represented a different tactical challenge, and each one was met with solutions that defied conventional military thinking. When a swarm of self-replicating attack drones burst from the Earth, Santos's team didn't try to destroy them faster than they could reproduce. Instead, they introduced a simple computer virus that made each drone believe it was the only real drone, and all the others were enemies to be eliminated. The swarm destroyed itself in minutes. When an ancient Forerunner defense construct activated a war machine so advanced that its technology was still beyond galactic understanding, the humans didn't try to overpower it. They simply started asking it questions. Lots of questions. About its programming, its purpose, its creators, and its ethical guidelines. The construct, designed to protect Forerunner installations from threats, became so busy trying to explain why humans weren't really threats that it forgot to actually fight them. When a biomechanical horror from the deep void attacked something that could regenerate from any damage and adapt to any weapon used against it, the humans shot it with paintball guns. The creature's adaptive systems, designed to counter lethal threats, were completely unprepared for something that was harmless, but annoying. By the time it realized what was happening, it had adapted itself into a form that was optimized for surviving paint pellets and utterly useless for combat. Each victory was achieved through the same basic principle. Humans didn't fight fair. They didn't follow rules. They didn't respect the established conventions of warfare. They looked at every enemy as a puzzle to be solved, rather than an opponent to be overpowered. "Incoming transmission from orbit," announced Corporal Martinez from the communications station. "The observers want to know how we're doing this." Santos considered that for a moment. "Tell them it's simple," she replied. "We cheat." "Ma'am? Every other species in the galaxy fights the way their enemies expect them to fight. They use superior technology, superior numbers, or superior physical capabilities. We don't have any of those advantages, so we use superior creativity instead." She gestured toward the smoking remains of a dozen war machines scattered across the battlefield. Every one of these constructs was designed by logical minds to fight logical opponents using logical tactics. But humans aren't logical. We're creative, adaptable, and completely unpredictable. We don't follow the rules because we don't accept that the rules apply to us. The final phase of the exercise was beginning. According to the schedule, they were about to face something that had never been defeated in direct combat. A cosmic horror from the spaces between stars, something so alien and powerful that most species considered them forces of nature rather than enemies to be fought. Santos watched as reality began to warp around the emergence point. The air itself seemed to scream as something that was never meant to exist in three-dimensional space began forcing its way into their reality. "All right, people," she called out to her teams. "Final exam. Remember, cosmic horrors have one critical weakness." "What's that, Sarge?" asked Chen. Santos grinned. "They're really pretentious." What emerged from the dimensional tier was indescribable, not because human language lacked the words to describe it, but because it actively violated the concepts that words were built on. It was large and small simultaneously, ancient and newly born, beautiful and hideous beyond measure. And the moment it fully materialized, Santos began laughing at it. "Oh, come on!" she called out to the cosmic entity that had destroyed entire star systems. "Really? The whole incomprehensible tentacle monster thing? What is this? Amateur hour?" The cosmic horror paused. In all its eons of existence, across all the realities it had consumed, nothing had ever laughed at it before. "I mean, seriously," Santos continued, her team taking their cues from her and beginning to spread out. The writhing tentacles, the mind-bending geometry, the whole "I exist beyond your understanding" attitude. Do you have any idea how overdone that is? We've got movies about things like you. Badly written movies. The entity's attention focused on Santos with the weight of a collapsing star. She could feel her mind beginning to crack under the pressure of its regard, but she kept talking anyway. "You want to know what's really cosmic horror?" she asked, pulling out a small device that looked like a modified smartphone. "Student loan debt. That's something truly terrifying that actually exists in our reality. While the cosmic horror was trying to process the concept of being mocked, Santos activated the device. It began broadcasting a signal directly into the entity's consciousness, not an attack, but something far worse from the perspective of a cosmic entity that prided itself on being incomprehensibly alien. It was a complete explanation of human social media, presented in easy-to-understand terms. The cosmic horror's reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Something that had existed since before the birth of stars, something that had consumed the dreams of entire civilizations, was suddenly forced to confront the reality of humans arguing about politics on the internet. Within seconds, the entity was retreating back to whatever dimension it had come from, apparently deciding that human reality was too weird and depressing to be worth conquering. Threat neutralized, Santos reported to the orbiting observers. And we didn't even have to shoot anything this time. As the dimensional tear sealed itself and the battlefield fell quiet, Santos looked up at the sky where she knew the galaxy's greatest military minds were watching in stunned silence. "Exercise complete," she announced. "Human forces are ready for debriefing at your convenience." She didn't mention that from the human perspective, this had been a fairly routine training day. After all, they hadn't encountered anything they hadn't seen before, and nobody had even been seriously injured, but somehow, she suspected that the observers above might not see it that way. The emergency session of the Galactic Council had been called for 0400 Standard Time, less than 12 hours after the human training exercise had concluded. In the 2,000 years since the Council's formation, an emergency session had been called exactly 4 times, once for the Andromeda Plague, once when the Void Hunters had emerged from deep space, once during the Core World's rebellion, and once when artificial intelligence had achieved sentience and declared war on organic life. Now, for the 5th time in galactic history, representatives from every major civilization were gathering in crisis mode. And this time, the crisis was a species that most of them had barely heard of 3 years ago. Ambassador Threndi of the High Ecclesiarchy was the first to arrive, her crystalline form reflecting the emergency lighting in prismatic patterns. As one of the galaxy's eldest species, her people had witnessed the rise and fall of a dozen galactic powers. Nothing surprised them anymore, or so she had thought, until 12 hours ago. "The recordings," she said without preamble as other representatives began filing into the council chamber. "Tell me someone has an explanation for the recordings." War Chief Brutus's massive form filled one of the reinforced seats designed for his species. The bone trophies adorning his armor told the story of a lifetime spent in combat against the galaxy's most dangerous threats. But today, those trophies seemed almost quaint. 300, he rumbled, his voice carrying the weight of disbelief. 300 humans. Against threats that should have required fleets. General Zoreth's compound eyes were moving in patterns that indicated deep stress among her people. "The Void Stalker," she said quietly. "My species has been trying to capture one for study for over 2 centuries. 47 of our best xenobiologists have died in the attempt. These humans, they did it with mining equipment and physics that any first-year engineering student could understand." Admiral Secton's tentacles were moving in rapid, agitated patterns as he reviewed data streams on multiple screens simultaneously. "I've run the combat analysis 17 times. The mathematics don't work. The strategies they employed shouldn't be viable against those target types. Yet they worked," finished Commander Vex Thul as he took his position at the observation platform. "Every single one of them worked flawlessly." The chamber fell silent as more representatives arrived. The quantum dancers, beings of pure energy who existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The stone hegemony, whose people were living mountains that had perfected defensive warfare over millions of years. The Forge Masters, cybernetic entities who could build weapons of mass destruction from raw materials in a matter of hours. Each civilization represented had military capabilities that could challenge the combined might of hundreds of lesser species. Together, they had maintained galactic peace through the simple understanding that no single threat could possibly challenge them all. That understanding had died 12 hours ago on a blue-green planet in what had previously been considered an insignificant star system. "Let's begin with the basics," said Council Prime Zereth, his ancient voice carrying the authority of a being who had mediated galactic conflicts for over 1,000 years. What exactly did we witness? Vexthul activated the holographic display system. The recordings began to play, showing the human training exercise from multiple angles and sensor perspectives. The assembled representatives watched in silence as 300 humans systematically dismantled threats that individually should have been capable of destroying entire armies. Computer analysis indicates that humans achieved a 100% mission success rate, Vexthul reported. 0 casualties. 0 equipment losses. Average engagement time per target. 14 minutes. Total time for all exercises. 6 hours, 37 minutes. Silence stretched across the chamber like a physical weight. The cosmic horror, whispered High Priestess Valeth of the Empathic Collective, her species' natural telepathic abilities having picked up traces of the entity's confusion and retreat. It didn't just leave. It fled. Something that has existed since the birth of stars fled from a human with a communications device. What was on that device? Demanded Brutus. Admiral Secton consulted his data streams. According to our intercepts of human communications, it was a complete archive of something called social media interactions, specifically focused on what humans term political discourse. The silence stretched longer. They defeated a cosmic horror, said Ambassador Threndi slowly, by showing it human political arguments. Apparently, Secton confirmed, the entity found human civilization so depressing and irrational that it chose to retreat rather than attempt conquest. War Chief Brutus began laughing, a sound like avalanches and earthquakes. They weaponized their own dysfunction. These humans. They turned their species' greatest weakness into a tool of war, but General Zoreth wasn't laughing. You're missing the point, she said, her voice cutting through the war chief's amusement. This wasn't about defeating individual threats. This was about demonstrating a mindset that makes every conventional military doctrine obsolete. She gestured toward the recordings, which had moved on to show human teams methodically studying each disabled threat. Look at them. They're not celebrating victory. They're analyzing what they learned. To them, every impossible challenge they just faced was a learning opportunity. Council Prime Zereth leaned forward, his ancient eyes focused on the display. Continue. Every species in this chamber fights according to established principles, Zoreth explained. We use our natural advantages, strength, speed, numbers, technology, psychic abilities, to overwhelm opposition. We follow doctrine because doctrine works. We maintain military traditions because those traditions were forged in victory. She paused, her compound eyes reflecting the holographic battle footage. Humans do none of those things. They have no natural advantages, so they refuse to fight fair. They have no superior technology, so they use inferior tools in superior ways. They lack our experience, so they ignore our lessons and invent their own solutions. For every problem we would solve with force, they find an answer that requires no force at all. The thermal lance used against the Titan mech, interrupted Ambassador Threndi. It's a mining tool. The quantum anchors that trap the Void Stalker, added Admiral Secton. Navigation equipment from civilian ships. The logic virus that crashed the Titan's AI, continued Brutus, his earlier amusement fading. Basic philosophy questions that any child could pose. The paint weapons used against the adaptive bioform, finished Vexthul. Literally toys. Children's toys. Council Prime Exareth was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 2,000 years of galactic politics. Implications? The chamber erupted in overlapping voices as every representative began speaking at once. Arguments about military doctrine. Debates over tactical paradigms. Discussions of strategic implications. But underneath it all was a current of something that the galactic community had rarely felt in recent centuries. Uncertainty. Order. Zereth's voice cut through the chaos. One at a time, Admiral Secton. Your assessment. The tentacled being's appendages moved in patterns of deep consideration. From a tactical perspective, Everything we think we know about warfare may be incorrect. Human methods suggest that superior firepower, advanced technology, and overwhelming force are actually disadvantages in many situations. Explain. The more powerful your weapons, the more you rely on them. The more advanced your technology, the more complex your weaknesses become. The larger your forces, the more predictable your strategies become. Humans seem to understand this intuitively. War Chief Brutus's tusks gleamed as he leaned forward. Are you suggesting that our military superiority is actually a weakness? I'm suggesting that our military superiority is based on fighting enemies who think like us. Humans don't think like us. They don't think like anyone. General Zoreth's compound eyes focused on the holographic display, which was now showing human teams dismantling war constructs with casual efficiency. There's something else. Something we're all avoiding, saying, which is, prompted Zereth. This was their training exercise, not a demonstration of their best capabilities, just their routine practice. Which means what we just witnessed represents the minimum baseline of human military competence. The implications of that statement settled over the chamber like a shroud. If this was what humans considered routine training, what would their actual military capabilities look like when deployed in earnest? We need to consider political ramifications, said High Priestess Valeth, her empathic abilities reading the emotional undercurrents in the chamber. If humans can neutralize threats that challenge our combined militaries using only basic equipment and creative thinking, then every power balance in the galaxy has just shifted, finished Ambassador Threndi grimly. Council Prime Zereth accessed his personal data archives, reviewing files that had been classified at the highest levels for decades. Computer. Display current conflicts where human military contractors have been employed. The holographic display shifted to show a star map of the galaxy. Red dots appeared, indicating active conflict zones. Blue dots began overlaying the red ones' conflicts where human military advisors had been hired. The pattern was undeniable. In every case where humans had been involved, conflicts that had raged for years had been resolved in weeks. Sieges that should have lasted months had ended in days. Military stalemates that had cost thousands of lives had been broken with minimal casualties. They're not just winning, observed Admiral Secton. They're winning efficiently, with minimum resource expenditure and maximum strategic gain. Because they're not trying to win, said Vex Thul suddenly. They're trying to solve problems. Every conflict they've been involved in has ended with solutions that left all parties better off than when the fighting started. Brutus snorted. Impossible. War is about victory and defeat. Winners and losers. Is it? General Zoreth challenged. The siege of Gamma Ceti, your people hired human advisors. How did it end? The war chief's expression darkened as he remembered. The planet surrendered. But not because we defeated them, because the humans convinced them that surrender was preferable to continued resistance. How? They. Brutus paused, clearly struggling with the memory. They demonstrated that they could provide better conditions for the planet's population as prisoners of war than the current government was providing as free citizens. By the end of the first day, the defenders were asking why they were fighting to preserve a system that treated them worse than their enemies would. And the result? The planet's government was reformed. The population's grievances were addressed, and my people gained a trading partner instead of a conquered territory. Brutus's voice carried a tone of bewilderment. Our casualties were minimal. The economic benefits exceeded those of traditional conquest, and we gained valuable intelligence about improved governance systems. Everyone won, Zoreth pointed out. Humans took a situation where victory required someone to lose, and transformed it into a solution where everyone gained something they wanted. This is what we're really dealing with, said Council Prime Zereth slowly. Not just a military force that can defeat superior opponents, but a mindset that can transform conflict itself into something entirely different. The chamber fell quiet again as the implications settled in. The galactic order had been stable for millennia because everyone understood the rules of power. Superior technology, larger armies, stronger weapons, these were the foundations upon which civilizations built their influence. Humans had just demonstrated that all of those foundations were optional. Recommendations? Xerath prompted. Full alliance status, said Ambassador Threndy immediately. Whatever they want, however they want it structured. We cannot afford to have them view us as potential enemies. Agreed, rumbled Brutus. My people respect strength. And what we saw today, that was strength beyond anything we've encountered. But it wasn't strength, Admiral Secton pointed out. That's what makes it so terrifying. They didn't overpower those threats. They outsmarted them. They didn't win through superior force. They won by understanding the nature of each challenge better than whoever created it. Which means, said General Zoreth grimly, that they've probably already figured out how to defeat every military force in this room. Not through conquest. Through solutions that make conquest unnecessary. High Priestess Valeth's empathic abilities were picking up something from the emotional undercurrents in the chamber that made her crystalline form dim slightly. There's something else we need to consider. The humans who conducted that exercise, they were having fun. What? My species reads emotional resonance across vast distances. The humans down on that planet weren't treating those challenges as life or death struggles. They were enjoying themselves. To them, facing down cosmic horrors and ancient war machines was recreational. The silence that followed was the deepest yet. Council, said Xerath finally, I believe we need to accept that the galaxy has changed, permanently. The balance of power that has maintained stability for 2 millennia has been fundamentally altered by a species that approaches warfare as if it were a puzzle to be solved rather than a contest to be won. And our response? Asked Vex Thul. We adapt, Xerath replied. Because the alternative is to find ourselves on the wrong side of human creativity. And, after what we witnessed today, I don't believe that's a position any of us wants to be in. As the emergency session continued into the galactic night, reports began arriving from across the galaxy. Human military contractors were suddenly receiving offers that exceeded the gross domestic product of entire star systems. Governments that had been locked in seemingly irresolvable conflicts were requesting human mediation services. Research institutions were offering unprecedented resources for joint research programs with human scientists. The galaxy's military academies had begun emergency revisions of their tactical doctrine. War colleges were implementing new courses on asymmetric problem-solving and creative conflict resolution. Arms manufacturers were scrambling to understand how mining equipment could be more effective than weapons designed specifically for combat. And on Earth, Sergeant Maria Santos was filling out routine after-action reports, completely unaware that she had just redefined warfare for an entire galaxy. Her final entry in the exercise log was characteristically brief. Training objectives met. All threats neutralized with 0 casualties. Equipment performed within expected parameters. Recommend increasing exercise difficulty for next iteration. Current scenarios may not provide adequate challenge for continued skill development. In the margins of the report, someone had added a handwritten note. Maybe next time we should try fighting fair. You know, just to see what happens. The signature was illegible, but it was followed by a small, smiley face. Somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, ancient powers that had slumbered for eons began to stir. The balance of galactic civilization had shifted, and entities that had not interfered in mortal affairs for millennia were suddenly paying attention to a small blue planet whose inhabitants had just proven that the impossible was merely another problem to be solved. But for now, the humans were still having fun. And perhaps that was the most terrifying thing of all.